Gwen Young is director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative and the Women in Public Service Project at the Wilson Center. She joins us today to talk about gender and trade. Now, two things people don't often think about together, but maybe they should be thinking about it more.
They absolutely should.
Lots of trade agreements in the news these days, particularly NAFTA here in North America. And a recent speech by Trudeau suggesting that he'd like to see protections for women included in the new NAFTA. Could you tell us about the idea behind that?
The idea behind it actually came from a recent trade agreement, which was the Chile-Canada agreement that was modernized in 2017. I think it was crafted in 1997, where they did include a gender trade provision. It was the second big free trade agreement that had any gender provisions whatsoever in it. And they made some really distinct provisions of what to do about gender, basically putting a gender lens on trade. And they made a steering committee, so a structural addition to the trade agreement. So right now, Trudeau is saying, if you want good economies, strong economies, if you want job creation, if you want sustainable economic growth, you have to include women. He's also saying Indigenous rights and environmental issues. So it's this inclusive growth in the economy that benefits all segments of society.
Is this, I mean, it would probably be too far to call it a trend, but is this some emerging thinking in international trade that this is a new frontier that needs to be addressed the way in the past, say, labor laws or environmental protections were addressed?
It's definitely emerging. I mean, the idea of including gender in trade was brought up at the Beijing conference in 1995, but yet to date, the WTO has no specific provisions. But what's happened since the Chile, so the first agreement was the Chile-Uruguay agreement, which was modernized in 2016. Now it's 2017, it's Canada-Chile. Important because Canada is a G20 nation. But now the EU is saying, we're about to renegotiate our agreement with Chile, and we're going to have a gender trade position in that. So Cecilia Malmström, the EU Trade Commissioner, saying this is what we need in it. And Trudeau is calling on this for NAFTA. So I would definitely say it's an emerging trend. And it's revolutionary. And I think it's about time.
I've heard a critic of Trudeau's called it a rhetorical flourish, or is just rhetorical flourishes. What does it take to put teeth into something like this?
Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, I think the quick answer to what it takes to put teeth is there has to be repercussions, or something that happens if you don't have that. The Chile-Canada agreement does not have that. But what it does has is the structural steering committee, and it has some really concrete things. It calls for sex-disaggregated data on businesses. It calls for training. It calls for a gender lens on trade. It has a list of almost 15 specific activities which the two countries will cooperate on, and it has a gender committee that will look at those activities. And so that in and of itself is important, and that's going to reflect what society is thinking, what businesses are doing, and what women business owners are calling for.
Ultimately, this gets to what is the impact that gender equality has on economic development within any country. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I could probably use the same figure that everybody uses. So McKinsey has said, if women are participating in the labor force at equal rates to men, the economy is going to grow between $12 and $28 trillion. I mean, and that's across the globe. We know that, if women are participating in the workforce in the United States, our growth will be 9% GDP. So we know that having women participate and be a part of the economy will grow the GDP. There's the other benefits of what happens to the programs, the delivery of services, more creative ideas. But what we do say is, economic growth tied to gender inclusiveness in the job force is a fact. There's an evidence base to prove it. So that's where this is going, and that's what's driving a lot of this.
I think of some work done by our environmental change and security program here at the center, where they've seen that in certain types of situations that focusing on educating women has been the biggest corrective that can be introduced into the equation. Do people get this? In a large scale, when you look around the world at the work that you're doing, do people understand the power of empowering women in these different types of ways?
People understand the power of educating primary school age children and potentially secondary school age children. And they understand the power of workforce training. The gap is the job creation.
Entrepreneurs and things like that.
Entrepreneurs. And taking women from being educated. I mean, women come out, they're 60%, over 61% of master's students are women. So sort of women going through the educational force is an accepted thing. The job creation, the promoting women, the getting them into the positions of leadership and into a lot of businesses. According to the World Bank, 34% of businesses have some sort of women in the ownership structure. So that's only 34. So the job creation and women in business isn't quite owned yet. What I will say about the women in education, I think people generally get it. People talk about educating girls across the world. What they're finding out, the UN is finding out, is that the quality of education, however, is still falling. it's still falling. And there's still countries like Nigeria and Cameroon where there's a large proportion of girls that are not in school for a variety
So
of reasons.
overemphasis on quantity and not enough on quality.
Absolutely.
The impact of trade on the wage gap, or the gender-based wage gap, is international trade a good approach to creating corrections in that regard?
Absolutely, because I think that the first thing it'll do is it's going to rectify some of the sectoral divisions where men and women are in the economy and in the jobs. So I think, a fair trade or a free trade economy will open up those sectors. It's going to address some of those issues of training of where women are. And I think that will go a long way. I don't think it's going to correct the wage gap, but it's definitely a necessary measure in order to narrow the gap between how much women make and how much men make.
A final thought, Gwen, is on your big project, the 50 by 50 project. How much of what we see emerging in these trade talks, or how much of what hasn't happened historically, is a function that it's mostly been men at the table in the past, and that as we're seeing that change, we may see these other things begin to emerge in a more prominent way?
Absolutely. I think that, the more women at the table, when you look at agreements like the Iran nuclear deal and you have women at the table, the more people see, the more they see the realities, but the more those concerns are taken into account. What you see here is you've got Michelle Bachelet of Chile, who happened to have headed UN Women, who happened to be committed to gender for a very long time, and Trudeau, who came in and appointed a gender equal cabinet. And as Laura Dawson here at the Canada Institute said, these trade agreements need to reflect social policies and where the thinking of society is in order to be effective trade agreements.
Gwen, thanks very much. Good talking to you, and look forward to the next time we get together.
Thank you, John.
Appreciate it.